Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final part of the BFG by Roald Dahl. Now, we're up to part 20, which makes this the longest book that I have read, and it has also taken a lot longer than it should have done because of all the interruptions with me going back to work. So thank you ever so much for sticking around and being here right to the end. Now, yesterday we saw how the armed forces captured the giants, and unfortunately, Flesh Lump Eater was lying on his arm, so they weren't able to tie him up. And while they tried to move him, he woke up and he grabbed one of the soldiers and threatened to eat him. But Sophie was very quick, and she took the brooch that the Queen had given her and stuck the pin part into the back of his heel, which made him drop the soldier. Now, the BFG very cleverly said that he'd been bitten by a snake, and the only way that he could stop the venom from spreading was to put his hands around his ankles, which actually was a really clever trick because it meant that they were then able to tie him up. And we ended it yesterday with the 9 giants being transported under a helicopter each back to England. And that's where we left it. So let's see what happens in the end. While the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilised to dig the colossal hole in which the 9 giants were to be permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines worked ceaselessly through the night under powerful arc lights, and the massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular, and engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if all 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the topmost giant would still be some 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered to the floor, but they were still trussed up, and now came the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down and do this because the moment a giant was freed, he would be sure to turn on the wretched person who had freed him and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer. "I's told you before," he said. "Giants is never eating giants, so I is going down, and I shall untie them myself before you can say Rack Jobbinson." With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering down into the pit, the BFG was lowered on a rope. One by one, he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in fury. "Why are you putting us down here in this grub-sludging hole?" they shouted at the BFG. "'Cause you is guzzling human beings," the BFG answered. "I's always warning you not to do it, and you've never taken the tittiest bit of notice." "Well, in that case," the Flesh Lump Eater bellowed, "I think we is guzzling you instead." The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he had brought back with him from Giant Country lay at the top of the pit. "What's in there?" the Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a gigantic black and white striped object the size of a man. "Snozcumbers," he cried. "This is the repulsant Snozcumber, Magister, and this is all we's going to give these disgusting giants from now on." "May I taste it?" the Queen asked. "Don't, Magister, don't," cried the BFG. "It is tasting of trog filth and pig squibble." With that, he tossed the Snozcumber down to the giants below. "There's your supper," he shouted. "Have a munch on that." He fished out more Snozcumbers from the sack and threw them down. The giants below howled and cursed. The BFG laughed. "It serves them right, left and centre," he said. "Well, what will we feed them on when the Snozcumbers are used up?" the Queen asked him. "Ah, they's never been used up, Magister," the BFG answered, smiling. "I is also bringing in this sack a old bungle of Snozcumber plants, which I's giving, with your permission, to the royal gardener to put in the soil. Then we's having an everlasting supply of this repulsant food to feed those first bloody giants on." "What a clever fellow you are," the Queen said. "You're not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool. I can see that." Every country in the world that had in the past been visited by the foul man-eating giant sent telegrams of congratulations and thanks to the BFG and to Sophie. Kings and presidents and prime ministers and rulers of every kind showered the enormous giant and the little girl with compliments and thank yous, as well as all sorts of medals and presents. The ruler of India sent the BFG a magnificent elephant, the very thing he'd been wishing for all his life. The king of Arabia sent them a camel each. The Lama of Tibet sent them a llama each. Wellington sent them 100 pairs of wellies each. Panama sent them beautiful hats. The king of Sweden sent a barrel full of sweet and sour pork. Jersey sent them pullovers. There was no end of gratitude of the world. The Queen herself gave orders that a special house with tremendous high ceilings and enormous doors should immediately be built in Windsor Great Park, next to her own castle, for the BFG to live in, and a pretty little cottage was put up next for Sophie. The BFG's house was to have a special dream storing room with hundreds of shelves in it where he could put his beloved bottles. What is more, he was given the title of the Royal Dream Blower. He was allowed to go galloping off to any place in England on any night of the year to blow his splendid fizz wizards in through the windows to sleeping children. And letters poured into his house by the million from children begging him to pay them a visit. Meanwhile, tourists from all over the globe came flocking to gaze down in wonder at the 9 horrendous man-eating giants in the great pit. They came especially at feeding time, when the snozzcumbers were being thrown down to them by the keeper, and it was a pleasure to listen to the howls and growls of horror coming up from the pit as the giants began to chew upon the filthiest tasting vegetable on earth. There was only one disaster. 3 silly men who had drunk too much beer for lunch decided to climb over the high fence surrounding the pit, and of course they fell in. There were yells of delight from the giants below, followed by the crunching of bones. The head keeper immediately put up a big notice on the fence saying, "It is forbidden to feed the giants," and after that there were no more disasters. The BFG expressed a wish to learn how to speak properly, and Sophie herself, who loved him as she would a father, volunteered to give him lessons every day. She was even taught him how to spell and to write sentences, and he turned out to be a splendid, intelligent pupil. In his spare time he read books. He became a tremendous reader. He read all of the Charles Dickens, whom he no longer called Dolls Chickens, and all of Shakespeare, and literally thousands of other books. He also started to write essays about his own past life. When Sophie read some of them, she said, "These are very good. I think perhaps one day you could become a real writer." "Oh, I would love that," said the BFG. "Do you think I could?" "I know you could," Sophie said. "Why don't you start by writing a book about you and me?" "Very well," the BFG said. "I'll give it a try." So he did. He worked hard on it, and in the end he completed it. Rather shyly he showed it to the Queen. The Queen read it aloud to her grandchildren. Then the Queen said, "I think we ought to get this book printed properly and published so other children can read it." This was arranged, but because the BFG was a very modest giant, he wouldn't put his own name on it. He used somebody else's name instead. But where, you might ask, is this book that the BFG wrote? It's right here. You've just finished reading it. So that's the end of the BFG. I hope you've enjoyed that. Now, I was going to stop now as it's summer holidays, but I have decided that I will continue with the stories at least until September. Things back then will be normal in school, so I probably will have to stop, but I will continue through the summer holidays. Now, I've got a choice of 2 books that I might start reading tomorrow. They're both chapter books. They are books that I will have read to children in my class before, but not all of the children. And these are 2 books that potentially the children wouldn't have heard of because they're not particularly common. So I'm going to have a think overnight which of the 2 I'm going to read, and then I will start reading that one tomorrow. So it'll be a nice surprise for you. So thank you for joining me for the last 20 parts. And I will see you again tomorrow with part 1 of a new story. Take care, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.